Okay, today I'm going to be looking at various aspects of criminality and the legal system. I'm going to go back into the history of the situation, how criminals and miscreants were treated in the early modern period, in the 16th, 17th centuries, how that evolved through the 18th century and led to the Victorian attitude towards crime, which uh, ended up with the development of the police force and things like that. So, starting then with the history of 17th, 18th century England, we are dealing with a period when really there wasn't much sense that any particular crime was more serious than any other, at least not in terms of the penalty that a crime would incur. If you were convicted of a crime, you could either be put to death or you could be pardoned and set free. And usually you'd get one of those two. Although, as we shall see, in addition to being set free, there was the possibility that you would be sent as a convict to one of the colonies where you would be working, doing hard labour for several years. So, just as an example, we might want to look at Moll Flanders in Daniel Defoe's famous novel. Now, this is set in the 17th century, although it was published in the 18th century, and Moll is a thief. Here she is, she's just engaged in an act of prostitution with this man. Here she's got him drunk, and he's now in a catatonic state, and she's calmly relieving him of his possessions. And eventually she is caught and she's sent to Newgate Prison, where she's tried and sentenced to death. Newgate, incidentally, was the prison where her mother was when Moll was born. So Moll was actually born in Newgate Prison, and it looks as if she's going to die after being sent to Newgate Prison later on in her life. But now this is the video version. It's much more dramatic. She's actually there with the noose around her neck when her lover comes up, having received a pardon or a reprieve, and in the movie it's very dramatic. In the book it's not quite as dramatic as that, but the same basic message is there, that she's supposed to be being hanged, but there's a reprieve. There's an authority is appealed to that decides, no, we won't hang her. And in her case, she is one of those who is sent to the colonies as a convict. But her friend in the novel is not so lucky. She is one of the thousands of men, women and children who were put to death in the 17th and 18th centuries. Again, she's a thief and she's being punished for stealing. We tend these days to think of the death penalty as something that happens to murderers, so you may be shocked or at least surprised to know that there were hundreds of crimes, 222 crimes according to the usual records, for which the death penalty was mandatory. That is to say, that was the obligatory punishment. There was no other punishment. If you committed those crimes and you convicted of those crimes, you would be subject to the death penalty, and you would either suffer and be put to death, or you would receive a reprieve or a pardon. For example, if you hung out with gypsies for more than a month, you could be put to death, according to the statute book. If you harmed cattle, if you damaged them in any way, if you damaged Westminster Bridge as opposed to any other bridge, I'm not quite sure what the logic was here, but Westminster Bridge seems to have carried a special penalty for anybody damaging that bridge. Impersonating a Chelsea pensioner. The Chelsea pensioners are a group of people who wore, and still exist actually, and wear bright, colourful uniforms they have a particular position in English society. If you pretend to be one of those, you'd be put to death. If you're a child who just appears to be evil, who seems to be nasty, then apparently you could be put to death. If you stole from a shipwreck, well, that was a particularly nasty one because very often the wreckers had actually engineered the shipwreck. They had lured the ship onto the rocks, and then they would loot and steal from the ship as the passengers on the ship were dying and drowning. So it was a particularly nasty crime. Poaching, though, would just be something like going out and shooting a rabbit. And stealing from a rabbit warren, you can see further down the list, is also punishable by death. Begging without a license, writing a threatening letter, destroying the roads, pickpocketing, and even being out at night with a blackened face, which suggested that you were going to go out and steal because in a time with no electricity, no street lighting in many areas, at night things would be dark, and so if you painted your face black, then it would indicate that you were about to do no good. You were trying to slip through in the dark without being recognized, without being observed, and that you were going to go and steal, probably break into a house or something like that. All of these crimes were punishable by death. The most shocking one for us perhaps being that even children who had perhaps not even committed any particular crime were subject to the death penalty. Well, that does look pretty bad, but it wasn't as bad as it looks, at least most of the time. Mostly children would be granted a reprieve and the penalty wouldn't actually be carried out. They'd sort of go through the process and then say, okay, we scared you, good, we're glad we scared you, but we're not actually going to put you to death. On occasion, though, they did. So that, for example, going through the historical record, we find that in the 16th century, an 11-year-old girl was hanged, and we don't really even know why. There's no record of what her crime was. In 1629, a 9-year-old boy was hanged for arson. That is, he started a fire. He was 9 years old, and he was put to death. In 1738, a 16-year-old servant girl was burned for murdering her mistress. She was burned rather than hanged because her crime was considered to be treason. More than just a murder, it was supposedly a betrayal or an act against her country in some sense. And then a little bit later on, in 1776, towards the later part of the century, a girl was hanged simply for setting fire to a haystack, a pile of dried grass. She burned a pile of dried grass and was put to death for it. And another in 1794 was hanged for killing her grandfather. So it did sometimes happen, not often, but there were cases when children were put to death. This thing about the woman who was burned, well, actually, by the 18th century, they would normally not actually be burned, they would be strangled first, and that would be the dead body that was burned. And the last time this was done was in 1784. It does sound awful, it seems barbaric, the burning, but it was actually, the initial intention was that it was a kinder alternative to the equivalent punishment for men, which was to be partially hanged and cut down while they were still alive and then have their insides cut out. Sorry, if you haven't had your breakfast, this is going to be very upsetting perhaps, but that's the way that these things were, and that ceased to exist as a crime or the last person at least to be hanged for it, or hanged and quartered in that way, was in 1782. So let's look at how the death penalty went through a process of reform in the Victorian period. Up until Queen Victoria's reign, there had been perhaps 7,000 people actually put to death. About 20% of the total number who were convicted and sentenced to death, which was about 35,000. This would be mostly men, but also included women and some children. And then over the 19th century, one of the big reforms that's noticeable is that the number of crimes that you can be put to death for is very much reduced. As I say, it was in the hundreds at the beginning of the 19th century, but by the time we reached the 1860s, the only crimes punishable by death were basically 4: murder, the one we'd mostly expect; treason, that is acting against the country; piracy in any form; and starting a fire in a naval dockyard, because that would be particularly damaging to the economy and a risky thing to do. So those 4 crimes remained on the statute books as being punishable by death. Executions were carried out in public. There were apparently about 100,000 people who went to the hanging of Henry Fauntleroy, perhaps because he was a high-class gentleman in 1824. And it was a media event. The details were all published in newspapers and so on. And as the century progressed, special trains were being laid on to take people to executions. And so we have this whole idea of execution as a public event, to a certain extent as a moral lesson, but also, quite importantly, as frankly, a form of entertainment. A lot of the crowd would have been drinking alcohol. The atmosphere could be unruly, quite wild, sometimes even dangerous, leading on occasion to people dying, as in 1809 when 27 people were trampled to death. Not quite sure what happened there, but the crowd got out of control and people were trampled to death. And the feeling, the mood during the course of the 19th century, the mood was changing, and as early as 1868, the public death penalty was abandoned, and from then on, the death penalty would be imposed behind closed doors. Dickens himself attended a number of executions, and in his writings about those executions, he has a lot of criticisms to make, condemnations of the behaviour of the crowd, but it's also suggested by some critics that he actually enjoyed it himself, that for him too it was, in a certain sense, entertainment. This whole idea that the punishment of criminals was a form of entertainment goes back a long way. My mother lived in the village of Rottingdean in Sussex, a few miles from Brighton, and there's a street there called Whipping Post Lane. Whenever I went down that street, I would think, good God, look at that, Whipping Post Lane. And this is what a whipping post would have been. Most of the whipping posts have gone. They would normally have been made of wood, but some of them, like this one, were made of stone, and this is still standing in the village of Ripple in Worcester. But every village, 200 years ago, pretty much every village would have a post that people could be tied to and publicly whipped. You'll see also in this picture, next to the whipping post, there is, this is called the stocks. It's a device where people's legs can be locked up. The top half opens up, people put their legs in, and then it's closed up, and their legs are trapped in those holes, and they just have to sit there. And people can come along and throw things at them, or insult them, or just look at them and laugh at them, or whatever, until they're allowed to go free again. And here we see in 1656 the public punishment of a Quaker. He is being tied to a wagon on the left here, and the wagon is pulled by a horse, dragging him through the town, and he's being whipped up and down the streets as the horse moves forwards. Then, not satisfied with that, they took him off and tied him. He's tied to a pillory here, and his tongue is being cut out. Again, very nasty, vicious kind of punishment. And the homeless, people who were beggars on the streets, again, were subject to all kinds of public punishment. This is an engraving from the 1530s showing beggars being whipped through the streets. And here is the pillory. This pillory would apparently, because it's for two people, one wonders whether its primary intention was for it to be used as a way of humiliating adulterers, men and women who had slept together outside of marriage. And it's also that placing it high up like that makes their public humiliation that bit more public, so that they can be seen from quite a long way off. And yes, people could mock them, people could throw things at them, and so on. And if the torture of humans wasn't enough for you, you could see the torture of animals, again, on a fairly routine basis. Even Queen Elizabeth, who is considered to be, she was a much gentler person than, for example, her father, who chopped off two of his wives' heads and who really was a kind of monster, really, in terms of putting people to death, executing them, punishing them in the most terrible ways. His daughter was a much gentler person in that sense. She didn't chop people's heads off unless she really, really had to. But even she was said to have enjoyed going out to watch the bear baiting, where dogs would fight it out with a bear, and people would bet, how many dogs would get killed before the bear finally died, that kind of thing. So again, pretty brutal. Now, by the time the Victorian period came along, these forms of entertainment were very much reduced or no longer existed. Bear fighting, for example, bear baiting, more or less, I don't think there were any examples of bear biting in the 19th century. There were still illegal cockfights, okay, and other types of cruelty against animals, dog fights, cockfights, and so on. These would take place. They were increasingly made illegal, so progressively. The earlier part of the century, some of these practices were still not actually completely illegal. But the other ones, the punishment of humans, these were dying out progressively as the 19th century went on. So that, for example, the pillory was abolished in 1837, and the stocks were not actually abolished, but they died out. They stopped being used as a form of punishment. Here's a man in the stocks in 1860. I believe this is in Cornwall, but it would be a very unusual punishment by this stage, and the very last time that the stocks were used was in 1872. What was happening along with this reduction in publicly punishing people on the streets was a rise in the prison system. Now, clearing the streets of performances of cruelty could be seen as a step forward, a kind of new age, that humans are progressing, they're becoming less violent, less cruel. We'll come back to this thesis a little bit later on. But there's another way of looking at it. There's another side to this story, because we are seeing more punishment in the form of imprisonment and punishment that's hidden from sight. Now, the use of prison had been growing over the 17th and 18th centuries. It was used in a rather different way from the way it came to be used later on and is used today. Most of these prisons were private. Conditions were often absolutely terrible. Poor people in particular were subject to being imprisoned in totally unhygienic surroundings, and they were likely to catch diseases and even to die of them. And these prisons were mostly basically just private places, and the prisoners would have to pay for their food and for all their services. Everything they would have to pay. So the poor people would suffer because they were completely destitute. They could not even afford to eat while in prison, so they depended on somebody's charity or mercy, which might be forthcoming or might not. Very different from the way that we see prisons today. One common reason for imprisonment at this time was debt. People owed money. Here's a debtor's prison pictured by William Hogarth in the 18th century. Well, we would probably think, well, what's the point of locking people up if they owe you money? They can't do anything once they're locked up. They can't pay back the money they owe. So locking people up in prison for owing money would seem to be counterproductive to us. But in those days, that was the normal thing to do. People would have to ask their families or their friends to help them out and to help them to get the money. Or if they were lucky, they might get money by some other method, even while in prison. But they were actually locked up until they could pay the money they owed. So private individuals who were owed money would employ a bailiff, an official, whose job it was to collect the money or to get property, if the money was not available, to take property from the person who owed, or to take the person who owed money to prison, depending on the situation. These prisons were privately owned. Conditions were very different depending on your social class and how much you could pay. If you were rich, you could be kept in a very luxurious kind of prison. We can see, for example, in Vanity Fair, Becky's, the central character, Becky's husband is put into a debtor's prison, and it's really just a room in a private house. It's perfectly comfortable. The only thing is that it's got bars instead of a door, and he's locked in there until he can pay his debt. And like pretty much everything else, this whole system was reformed from the bottom up during the 19th century. The first thing that we see in 1815 is jailers being paid by the state. And the system whereby prisoners are paying jailers for services is, at least theoretically, ended at this stage, although it went on unofficially. The system changed slowly. Despite the legislation, the system did not change overnight. Then from 1823, they started looking at different categories and types of prisoner and keeping different prisoners separate from each other, so that the violent murderers were kept separately from people whose crimes did not involve violence and so on, partly for the protection of the criminals, of the prisoners, but also so that they didn't teach each other useful skills, so that, for example, professional thieves would not be teaching how to steal to other inmates and that sort of thing. And also making a difference between people on the basis of sex, so that women prisoners have to be guarded by female warders. And at the same time, we get the idea that if you behave well while in prison, you'll get out that bit quicker, which is still a principle that exists in the prison system today. And then in 1835, they started to have officials who would go around and inspect the prisons and make sure that the conditions were satisfactory. And the process of reform went on. We've got child offenders being treated differently from adults, so that you get reform schools being set up from about the middle of the century on as an alternative to prison. We get the debt laws changing, so that after 1869 people aren't going to be put into prison just because they owe money. We get the closure of some of the worst prisoners, and the prisoners all come under a central control in 1878. Not all the reforms are for the benefit of the prisoners, so you get things like the Penal Servitude Act, which was one of those acts that sort of says, well, if we make the punishment strict, then people won't do the crime, so that hard labour, very often pointless labour, was it existed already, but it was made more severe at this time in order to discourage prisoners from reoffending. You may remember the same kind of thinking when it came to the New Poor Law Act, that again made the workhouses as unpleasant as possible so that people wouldn't stay in them. And here we have an example of the treadmill, which was a device made for people to walk hour after hour, simply like a hamster in a cage. They would walk on the mill, and the mill would go round. Sometimes that would be used to generate energy. For example, a mill could be used to make bread, to grind flour for making bread, that sort of thing. Sometimes it would just be there as a form of punishment with no practical application. In Oliver Twist, you may remember that Oliver tells the gang in London, "I have been walking for 7 days," and the gang assumes that that means walking in this way, that he's been put in prison and that he has to spend 8 hours a day or whatever it is walking on the treadmill. Of course, what little Oliver means is that he's been walking from the town that he was born in to London, but it's misunderstood by the others that he's been walking in this sense, that he's been walking the treadmill. And the colonies, the whole principle of sending criminals to do hard labour in the various parts of the British Empire. Transportation, it was called. It was something, as the empire started to develop, it became a practical way of getting rid of criminals from inside the country, and also it fed a demand. Cheap labour was needed, and criminals could provide cheap labour. This went on during the 17th and 18th centuries. Firstly, America was the main destination for these people. We get that in Moll Flanders. She's sent to Virginia. But after that, after the American War of Independence, Australia becomes the typical destination. And this would be the situation in Dickens's time. There were 160,000 men, women and children, more than that, and they were sentenced to penal servitude. They were shipped to Australia over a period of about 80 years, a sort of heyday of transportation. And the conditions, especially in the early days, the conditions were very harsh, and people might even die on the way because the dirt, the lack of fresh food. The journey was a very long and hard journey. And those who did survive would then have to do hard manual labour. They would be physically punished severely if they misbehaved. It was a very, very terrible punishment for those people. And these would be the kinds of ships in the early days. Of course, later on, steam would be introduced. But ships like these were, with sailing boats, sailing ships, were the typical convict ships, and the journey would take months, and many of the convicts would die in the late 18th century, although by the 19th century conditions were improving to such an extent that some convicts would arrive in better condition than when they set off. Usually it was a 7-year penalty, and then convicts were free to go as they pleased, and they could go back home to their countries afterwards, and some of them did. Others would stay in Australia and make a new life. Magwitch, for example, in Dickens's Great Expectations, is at first he's kept a prisoner in one of the hulks. These were ruined ships. As you can see, it's never going to sail again. The sails have all been taken off. The top deck area has been covered over with a roof and made into a kind of accommodation area. The prisoners that would also, they would be kept in the lower part of the ship, and these were dotted around the coastline of Britain in the Victorian period. And Magwitch somehow or other manages to escape. It's not very clear how he escapes, because he would have been chained with leg irons, and the ship would be fairly well off the shore, so it would be very difficult for people to escape. But somehow or other Magwitch does escape, and he's caught again and sent to Australia. Not for the usual 7 years, but for life. Well, for life in the sense that he was not allowed to go back to England. His sentence was for 14 years. Once the 14 years were up, he was a free man, but he was not allowed to go back to Britain, or he would be hanged. Now, this was a very specific situation. The last person who was hanged for that was in 1810, and the law was changed in 1835. Sometime, a good number of years before Dickens wrote the novel. So it's very important to notice that Dickens wrote the novel after that crime of, after that punishment of being hanged for the supposed crime of returning to the country had been abolished. That no longer existed when the actual novel was written and published. He's writing about an earlier period. This is the kind of detail that I'm hoping that you will realise is pretty important when you're dealing with novels and literature in general, understanding how it fits into the actual context of the period in which it was written. And the so-called civilizing process. We've got the idea that humanity is developing and becoming less cruel. And we could give it as an example that we don't have these corporal punishments. We don't whip people publicly, and the death penalty in most countries now, for example, isn't used, and we can see, or is abolished. And we can see during the Victorian period a steady development away from those kinds of punishment. Well, one theory is that we're getting less violent, we're getting more civilized. And this is Steven Pinker, in recent times, has popularized this theory. It's got numerous adherents, and that's one way of looking at it. It's an attractive theory, but there are, against that theory, there's the argument Well, there are several arguments, but one argument would be that we aren't any less cruel now than we were before. It's just that it's no longer acceptable to show that cruelty openly. It's hidden out of sight. Those people on the treadmill would be being punished away from everybody's sight. An example I like to give is regarding animals. Most of us have probably never seen an animal having its throat slit and bleeding to death the way that one would 200 years ago. Most of us have never seen an animal enduring that kind of cruelty, and yet we would, nearly all of us, go to the supermarket and buy a little plastic package that contained the meat of an animal whose life had been lived out of our sight and whose death had been inflicted out of our sight. So that nothing's really changed, it's just that we sanitize it in our modern world. And at the same time as you've got this decline in public punishment, you've got a huge rise in the use of prisons and transportation, kind of pushing the problem out of sight and pushing the suffering offender, the prisoner, the criminal, out of public view, so that they still have to endure their suffering, but it's no longer a form of entertainment or a form of moral edification or any kind of public spectacle anymore. And finally, the police force. We're so used to thinking of the police as being the people who to go to if there's a crime, or the people who maintain law and order, that it's going to come as something of a surprise to think that until the middle of the 19th century, there really was no effective police force except, a little bit earlier in London, and that the main person responsible for catching and prosecuting a criminal would be, in most cases, the victim of the crime. And they might have their friends to help them. They might have an unpaid constable. The constable's job was not a paid position. It was a sort of service to society, and the crowd itself, the public, the general public. If the cry went up, "Thief, thief!" everybody in the street would stop what they were doing and they'd run off to try and catch the thief. So the society would police itself in that way, in that sense. Once a person was accused of a crime and had been caught, they would be brought before a magistrate, and it would be the magistrate's job to decide whether to pursue that and make a criminal charge. And it was in 1829 that an actual police force was set up in London, and in 1856 that spread and there was a national police force across the country. Here we see the early 1829 peelers, as they were called. The name peelers comes from the politician who set up this police force, Robert Peel, and this is an early photograph showing the London police force in the Victorian period. And then later on, by the 1860s, this had spread out across the country and eventually became a national police force. Robert Peel was still remembered as the founder of the police force. Robert is Bobby, and so the Bobbies, rather than the Peelers, which was the original name using his family name, they became the Bobbies using Robert. And you'll still hear people talk about the police as Bobbies even today. So this is the way that during the 19th century the police force was slowly set up. Now, the setting up of the police obviously made a big difference to the way that society treated crime and criminality. It was now something that was being handled by a special body of people. But quite what would be fair, what would be justice, what would be the right way for the police to behave was something that society was still trying to work out. You had some people and some areas of the country, some strata of society that would happily see the police cooperate in beating small children, for example, as in this example from Yorkshire in 1877. The two children are supposed to have stolen pigeons, which were kept in those days as food. We're not talking about the kind of feral pigeon that we see in the cities. These were specially bred pigeons. But even so, flogging them in this way was something that still survived, but led to protests, and those protests led to reform. So what we need to understand is that we can't make a single sweeping generalization about attitudes towards crime. At the same time as there were people punishing children in that way, there were other people who were saying, this is a terrible thing. This isn't something a civilized society should be doing. Okay, so you've got changes that are going on through the period, and you've got tremendous variety at any one time between different members of society and different groups within the society. And showing sensitivity to that rather than stereotyping is something that's very important, and I'll come back to it in a later lesson. So if you want to find out a little bit more about all of this, then I recommend you to go to the wonderful Victorian Crime and Punishment website. It's got so much information, so much detail, and it really will give you a fantastic insight. So that's it for this presentation, and I'm hoping that you will have a much clearer sense of the complexity of the situation, and also how any particular novel by Dickens or any other writer needs to be seen in the context of exactly what was going on at that particular time, because things were changing quite considerably during the course of the 19th century.